The jungle was never quiet. From sunrise to sundown, the air trembled with the high, metallic whine of cicadas. Birds screeched in the canopy, their calls echoing through the dense green. The Kwai Noi River rolled slowly past, its surface the color of old tea, hiding currents that could pull a man under in seconds. The heat clung to skin like wet wool. Even in the shade, sweat soaked through shirts and ran in rivulets down backs. And beneath it all, every day without fail, there was the sound of labor, the pounding of hammers, the creak of ropes, the bark of Japanese orders cutting through the heavy air. It was the sound of a bridge being built, and of men dying to make it. In October 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army had been in control of Burma for months. Their supply lines, however, were strained. The sea route from Bangkok to Rangoon was vulnerable to Allied submarines and aircraft. The answer was bold and brutal. A 258-mile railway carved through the wilderness between Thailand and Burma. The terrain was unforgiving, mountains, rivers, thick jungle, and the climate swung between baking heat and monsoon downpours. The Japanese planners estimated it would take 5 years to complete. They would finish it in just over one, by burning through human lives. They gathered their workforce from across Asia, conscripted Burmese, Malays, Thais, Chinese, Tamils, tens of thousands pressed into service. And then there were the prisoners of war, over 60,000 Allied troops, most captured when Singapore fell. The journey to the camps was the first ordeal. Packed into sweltering railway boxcars without food or water, they were shunted north for days. Those who didn't die on the way were marched for miles through jungle paths to reach their assigned sections of the line. One of the most important sections was the crossing over the Kwai Noi River near the Thai town of Kanchanaburi. To the Japanese, it was simply part of the line. 2 bridges, one wooden and one steel, that would keep the trains moving. To the men who arrived there, gaunt and fevered, it was a sentence. The camp itself was a cluster of bamboo huts with palm thatch roofs. The floors were bare earth, churned to mud in the rains. Men slept shoulder to shoulder on woven mats, swatting at mosquitoes that carried malaria. There were no latrines worth the name. Dysentery swept through the camp in days. At first light each morning the guards came. They shouted orders, sometimes striking men with bamboo canes or the butt of a rifle to get them moving. Breakfast was a ball of rice, maybe a few scraps of vegetable. Then the march to the site began, through sucking mud and swarms of insects. By the time the sun crested the tree line, the heat was already thick enough to make a man dizzy. The work started with the wooden trestle. Massive hardwood piles were cut from the jungle and dragged to the site. Teams of 20 POWs hauled each pole, roped together like animals, feet slipping in the mud. Once a pole was upright, another team took turns swinging sledgehammers against a steel cap, driving it deep into the riverbed. The rhythm was endless. Lift, swing, strike. The sound carried over the water like a drumbeat of exhaustion. The river itself was a hazard. In the dry months, its shallows filled with sharp stones and debris that cut bare feet. In the rains, it swelled and churned, turning brown and fast, sweeping away tools and occasionally a man. Leeches clung to ankles and calves until pried off with grimy fingernails, leaving wounds that often became infected. By the end of 1942, work began on the steel bridge. The spans, 11 of them, had been dismantled from a viaduct in Java and shipped upriver. They arrived coated in grime, baking under the sun until the metal was hot enough to burn. Without cranes, the men used ropes, pulleys, and their own strength to hoist them into place. Every lift was dangerous. Ropes frayed and snapped without warning. A girder could swing like a pendulum, crushing men against the timber supports. When that happened, there was no pause. The body was carried away and work resumed. Illness was constant. Malaria and cholera claimed lives in days. Tropical ulcers ate into legs until bone was visible. The Japanese provided almost no medicine. The camp's doctors, themselves POWs, boiled water for cleaning wounds and improvised bandages from scraps of cloth. Men too weak to stand were sometimes carried to the site by their mates, forced to labor until they collapsed. There was cruelty beyond neglect. Guards beat men for working too slowly. Some were forced to kneel in the sun for hours, holding heavy loads above their heads. A few who attempted escape were caught, beaten senseless, and in some cases executed in front of the others. And yet, the prisoners found ways to resist. Sabotage became an art, loosening bolts so they would fail later, dulling saw blades, taking deliberate wrong measurements to slow progress. Tools fell into the river. Each act carried the risk of brutal punishment, but it gave the men a sense of control over work that was meant to crush them. In early 1943, the Japanese demanded more. They called it speedo, an acceleration of the schedule to finish months early. For the men on the river, it meant 16 to 18 hours a day in the heat, with no rest days. Rations shrank as food was diverted to Japanese troops elsewhere. The death toll soared. Men collapsed in the mud and were left until the day's work ended. Some never rose again. By February, the timber trestle was complete, and trains began crossing the river. The steel bridge followed weeks later, its black spans arching over the Kwai Noi, each one set with rivets, driven by men who had no choice. The Japanese marked the occasion with photographs. The prisoners marked it in silence, their eyes drifting to the jungle graves that lined the riverbanks. The bridge carried trains into Burma for more than a year, but the Allies knew of its importance. In 1944, American bombers struck the span, dropping sections into the river. The Japanese repaired what they could, but the damage was never fully undone. The war was turning against them. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the surviving POWs were freed. Liberation did not end their ordeal. Many carried the bridge with them, in nightmares, in scars, in the way they flinched at sudden noises. Some never spoke of it again. Others told the story over and over, trying to give shape to something too large for words. Today, a rebuilt version of the bridge stands in Kanchanaburi. Tourists walk its length, snapping photographs, leaning over the rails to watch boats pass below. They see the rust, the rivets, the symmetry of the spans. They do not feel the heat that seared the skin or the hunger that hollowed men from the inside out. They do not hear the hammers or the shouted orders or the quiet acts of defiance. And they do not know that beneath their feet lies a monument not to engineering, but to endurance, bought with the lives of men who never asked to build it. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.